Santa Catalina is probably the most famous of California's Channel Islands. It's also the only one of those islands to be privately owned or have a significant permanent civilian population of around 4,000. It's a popular resort community that receives more than 1 million visitors a year. But the trajectory of Catalina Island and its only incorporated town, Avalon, changed dramatically 109 years ago with the Great Fire of 1915. The cause of the fire remains a mystery and perhaps hides a dark secret. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Santa Catalina, commonly simply called Catalina, is part of Los Angeles County and sits approximately 29 miles south of the city of Long Beach. While the island had a native population as far back as 7000 BC, that population was lost during settlement by the Spanish in the 17th century. It was Spanish sea captain Sebastian Biscaino who gave the island its name after St. Catherine of Alexandria. The small community and tourist destination known today is largely credited to chewing gum, or rather chewing gum magnate William Wrigley, Jr. Wrigley invested millions of dollars and used his impressive marketing skills to turn Catalina into a world-class destination. He brought attention to the island by having the Chicago Cubs baseball team do their spring practice on the island, and also helped to establish the island as a movie filming location, which resulted oddly in the island's still surviving bison population. While much of the island was donated to a conservancy in 1975, many of the island's attractions are still owned by the Wrigley family through the Catalina Island Company. But while so much of what Catalina is today was the result of the efforts of Wrigley, he wasn't the first to have the vision of Catalina as a destination and playground for tourists, and his involvement largely came as the result of a tragedy. The island experienced a brief, not very productive gold rush in the 1850s, and by 1864 was owned by prominent San Francisco land developer James Lick. However, there was limited development on the island in the 19th century, and the island was mostly used for ranching. Sea Captain Augustus William Timms operated a sheep ranch on the island, and one of his vessels took pleasure seekers to the island to enjoy bathing at a small harbor that was called Timms Landing. A July 28, 1882 edition of the LA Times recounts a pleasure trip to the island, replete with pleasure, incident, and adventure. The camp and the place where we landed is at Timms Meadow on the southern end of the island. The camp consists of about 40 tents, occupied by about 150 persons of all ages and both sexes. People who came there for the sole purpose of having a good time, and they did have it. Bathing, fishing, boating, and hunting was the order of the day, and at night the young people congregate and play all manner of amusing games, and make the still night air ring with the peals of the merriest laughter. While that was a taste of the resort to come, 40 tents was hardly the extent of the island's potential. Recognizing the value of a playground for growing Southern California, in 1887, real estate developer George Chateau purchased the island from the Lick estate for $200,000. The newspaper The Catalina Islander writes, in those days Avalon Bay was known as Timms Landing and was not much more than a wide coastal valley devoid of any permanent human habitation outside of a pair of wooden structures, one of which operated as a hooch hut for the local fishermen. Chateau was another prominent real estate developer whose land holdings would eventually become part of Los Angeles, including most of Wilshire Boulevard. Chateau sought to establish Catalina as a resort, building a steamship pier and the magnificent Hotel Metropole, a name meaning center of hospitality, and laying out streets and landlots for a community. But Timms Landing would need a new name. The travel website Love Catalina Island writes, when George Cleveland, one of the surveyors, made up the first map, he put Chateau for the name of the town and Chateau Harbor for the bay. When George Chateau saw the map, he told Mr. Cleveland that he did not want the town named after him. Chateau's sister-in-law, Etta Whitney, was reading Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Idylls of the King, telling of the legend of King Arthur. In the poem, King Arthur is wounded in battle and takes himself to the island of Avalon. He then describes this perfect island where he will heal. Etta Whitney suggested that the town be named Avalon, and Chateau agreed. Reporter Jim Watson wrote in The Islander, ask any schoolchild who the founder of our country is, and they will no doubt tell you George Washington. Likewise, ask any longtime islander who the founder of Avalon was, and most of them will correctly tell you that it was George Rufus Chateau. But, Watson writes, Chateau was eventually forced to relinquish his command over the town and, in fact, the whole island. Due to less than stellar income from his Catalina Island enterprises, Chateau's finances were such that the island reverted once again to the Lick trustees. The island was then purchased from the Lick estate by the sons of shipping magnate Phineas Banning. Banning had previously been interested in buying the island, but had passed away in 1885. But his sons saw the possibility there and purchased the island for $128,740. They invested in the island as a resort. Journalist Sam Genier wrote in his blog South Bay History, "The Bannings immediately began making major improvements to Avalon. They attempted to transform it into a high-class tourist destination, and under their stewardship, the island became a fashionable vacation spot for the well-to-do." As the town grew, there was an independence movement, driven in part by residents who had purchased land from Chateau, and in 1913 the town of Avalon was incorporated. By 1915, it was a busy resort. A publication of the Friends of the Banning Museum, located in Los Angeles, writes, "For over 23 years, the three Banning brothers worked to create a paradise getaway that developed the barren landing at Avalon into a first-class tourist destination for people all over the United States and the world." By 1915, there were hotels, paved streets, wireless telegraph service, luxurious steamship transportation, restaurants, incline railway, tent cities for camping, waterfront bathhouse, and a wide range of outdoor activities that included deep-sea fishing, hunting, and horseback riding, all designed for the visitors. November was off-season, and many of the hotels, including the Metropole, had been closed for the winter. The Pomona, California Progress Bulletin reported on November 29, 1915. At 10 o'clock last night, the home of Captain J. Willie was broken into and set fire by an explosion of some sort. Robbery seemed to have been the motive. The Los Angeles Times reported that Willie's home on Eucalyptus Avenue was ransacked. The small fire department was able to extinguish the fire, but the Progress Bulletin writes, "The sheriff declared an explosion similar to one that had ruined the Willie residence occurred shortly after 3 a.m. in the Grandview Hotel." The Times wrote, "A general alarm was sounded, the boats in the harbor taking up the din, and the whole town was aroused. With most of the fire hose at the Willie property, where it had been left until daylight, and a strong northerly wind fanning the flames, it was early seen that nothing could save the property to the northeast of the Hotel Metropole. It was hoped, however, to save the latter, but even this hope was doomed when the wind shifted and carried the flames from the Bayview to a newly painted cornice of the Metropole." The South Pasadena Record reported Avalon only had 2 or 3 little hose carts with only a few hundred feet of fire hose. These proved fruitless against the mighty hell of flame that burst from the Grandview Hotel and spread to adjoining buildings. The Los Angeles Herald recounted the eyewitness report of H.M. Scott. "I was awakened at 3:50. The first I knew of the fire was the noise and yelling in the street. Everyone seemed to be out on the street at once. My wife was still asleep. In less than a minute, a bellboy almost broke open our door in the Bayview Hotel. 'Fire!' he shouted. 'Run for your lives! The whole thing is going to burn up!' I got on some of my clothes and helped my wife dress, and we gathered up our suitcases and our clothes and ran out in the hall. Everybody was trying to get out at once. Women in their nightgowns with their hair down their backs, and men and women barefooted were running around in the street. The whole sky was lit up by the fire. The Rose Hotel was in ashes, and the Metropole was burning like a paper box. The heat was so great that we had to go down to the beach and the tent colony, or we would have suffocated. I saw a woman carrying cats and dogs, and women with babies in their arms running out of the cottages. Everybody was trying to get out of the fire zone, but no one seemed to know what to do." Scott went back and joined one of the volunteer fire companies that were being formed, but he said, "We couldn't do anything to stop the fire. The hose wouldn't reach the building." The Times wrote, "Men and women fought the flames with every weapon at hand. While the men formed bucket brigades and even the boys beat at the flames with wet sacks, the women of the residence district began the work of moving out their belongings. Vehicles were requisitioned from all over the town and from the adjoining country, and the work of carrying stuff back to the hills was started, while the entire business district behind them seemed to be in flames." The Catalina Islander quoted an account by resident Johnny Wendell. At 2:30 a.m. on November 29th, young Johnny was abruptly wakened by the town constable, Al Wiggs. "Fire! Fire!" yelled Wiggs. Johnny ran into the street in the early morning darkness and beheld his town in flames. It looked like the whole town was going. That's exactly how it looked to everyone. The Islander writes, "The windows in the stately Hotel Metropole exploded in the heat, and the Morsage family pushed their piano out of the house and straight up Stagecoach Road. People were doing things they would never be able to do if everything was all right," said Wendell. Despite the size of the blaze, no one was killed. The Times wrote, "But in spite of the time of delirium, there were no injuries. Even Thomas Whitley, who jumped from the second floor of the Hotel Rose, escaped with minor bruises." The Santa Ana Daily Register reported that several firefighters were burned, but none seriously. On account of this being the off-season, many lives were probably saved. But the town had been devastated. The Herald reported, "Destroying more than $1.5 million worth of property, fire, which broke out at 3 o'clock this morning, swept the entire west side of Avalon, Catalina Island, and burned it to ashes." The Times wrote, "Between the waterfront and the wireless station and the Metropole Avenue on the Grandview property, there are only a few buildings standing." The Herald wrote, "The famed Metropole Hotel, in which countless thousands of tourists had been sheltered, is reportedly destroyed. It was insured for $100,000, it is said. The Grandview Hotel, in which the fire is said to have started, also reported totally destroyed. Many other buildings in the vicinity of the hotels, and compromising practically all of the western half of Avalon, are reported burned. The Register wrote, "The flames swept the wharf, licked up small boats in the harbor, and hampered the work of the steamer Hermosa. The Banning Company, controllers of the island, are the chief losers." While newspapers at the time assumed that the fire was the result of incendiaries, a term meaning arsonist, the Los Angeles Evening Express reported on December 2nd. Sheriff Klein sent several detectives to Avalon to make an investigation, but after their return, it was announced that only residents whose homes had been burned had made such charges, and these were said to have been made on hearsay evidence. Sam Genier noted, no official cause for the fire was ever found. But the Catalina Islander writes that Johnny Wendell's account, which was taken as part of a project to record oral history of the island and kept on a barely audible old history cassette tape from the 1970s, including a shocking possibility. Wendell goes on to describe how he was told by Tinch Morsich and Squirrel Darcy about how, in the midst of the maelstrom, they had to rescue the mother-in-law of the owner of the Hotel Rose, who had evidently been intentionally locked in the attic. Morisich, who would later become town constable, had to bust open a padlock and force a trapdoor open to free the woman, injuring his shoulder in the process. Wendell then goes on to say how the woman's son-in-law had, only days before the fire, curiously begun to move his belongings out of the hotel. "Let me get this straight then," asked the interviewer. "We're assuming the son-in-law locked the mother-in-law in there to do away with her?" "You can assume what you want," said Johnny. The Islander speculates. Was Avalon's Great Fire of 1915 intentionally set by the owner of the Rose Hotel? If so, was it done for insurance purposes or, chillingly, to do away with an inconvenient mother-in-law? The L.A. District Attorney reportedly came out to investigate the story, but without result. After the fire, there were some recriminations about the amount of fire equipment that the fire department owned, but the fire chief argued that pretty much everything was done that could be done under the conditions. The Banning brothers hoped to rebuild, but the cost of the fire was enormous, and the debts that they incurred compelled them to sell the Catalina Island Corporation, where it eventually fell into the hands of William Wrigley, who turned it into the attraction that it is today. The 1915 fire changed the trajectory of the island that today receives more than 1 million visitors a year, but it remains unexplained. The fact that a fire was started the night before, apparently connected to a robbery on the opposite side of town, and the anecdotal descriptions of explosions suggest that perhaps there was some nefarious plot, but by whom and for what purpose has never been clear. The Great Avalon fire might have simply been caused by some mundane cause, a kitchen fire getting out of control, but it seems that the cause of the fire is destined to remain unexplained. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.